Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, dear friends in Canada, chers amis. My name is Claudia Paganini, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Christian Philosophy of the University of Innsbruck and a guest professor at the Munich School of Philosophy. It is my great pleasure to participate in the Austrian-Canadian lecture series showcasing young Austrian scholars and scientists, and I'd like to extend my particular gratitude to Dr. Macher, the director of the Austrian Cultural Forum in Ottawa, who invited me. This is not my first contact with Canada. I've been to Canada several times. I practically inherited my love for Canada from my mother, who is a sworn Canadianist. I studied philosophy and theology at the Universities of Vienna and Innsbruck, and received my habilitation degree from the Munich School of Philosophy. Here in Innsbruck, I've been organizing the Austrian-Canadian Ethics Workshop of the university for the past 6 years, and today's lecture will take us once more into the fascinating field of ethics, more specifically into that of media ethics. In the past decades, media ethics has successfully established itself as a scientific discipline in its own right. In the public perception, however, it is only when it comes to scandals, special incidents, or so-called triggering events that its relevance becomes apparent. This applies to Austria as well as to Canada, where the case of Joseph Boyden, for instance, author of several novels, has raised the question to how much authenticity an artist is obliged to commit himself when he presents himself, his story, and his work in the media. Boyden has claimed for years to have indigenous roots, a claim which eventually could not be substantiated. Through his continued self-staging as having Mi'kmaq and Métis ancestors, and later on Nipmuc and Ojibwe roots, he had drawn special attention to his literary work it might not have received otherwise. And he received at last one prize that had been intended for indigenous authors only. Apart from such scandals, it is the so-called social media that are currently the focus of particular interest. And in today's lecture, I would therefore like to examine the question whether the media, and more precisely the social media, operate with values and how they can be specified. In other words, how can we understand the functioning of the media and, subsequently, how can we shape them? As we all know, social media users are not only consumers, but they react and publish in their own right. The border between author and audience therefore becomes or has become blurred. The individual not only presents contents, nutritional tips or commentaries on current public topics, he also presents himself. And as a consequence, the boundaries between what is private and public gradually dissolve. At the same time, the user interacts with others. He experiences fellowship and creates his own virtual world in which he spends part of his lifetime. This gives him the impression that he holds innumerable creative possibilities and that he may navigate, much like a discoverer, through a cosmos of unlimited choices. De facto, however, the individual actor hardly ever discovers a new territory, but moves in predefined structures and picks up thoughts conceived by others. This said, social media may also be understood as a form of empowerment, because one no longer has to be rich or famous in order to create a public platform. But at the same time, the standardized self-presentation in the web leaves little room for creativity and the expression of one's own personality. Going for likes and followers, users tend to reproduce the viewer's expectations and to satisfy rigid role models. The authenticity of self-presentation, therefore, is always at risk. Another issue to be taken into consideration is the question of materiality and spatiality, the visual reality of the Internet creating the impression of real space. But since this promise cannot be fulfilled and the physical dimension of the person's identity is not realized, there is the urge for its realization in the offline world. At the same time, the lack of materiality changes the perception of the other and his presence. With the loss of physical presence, a whole series of important markers such as gesture, facial expressions, body language gets lost, which would be necessary to assess the quality of a relationship or the current mood of the other person. This is compensated on the one hand by declaring the relationship status, such as married or in a relation with, etc., and on the other by creating substitute gestures like emoticons. These substitute gestures enhance symbolic action, such as joining a friends list, and are perceived as signs of a certain quality of relationship, such as intimacy, for instance. In doing so, new rituals are being created, which primarily serve to ensure a common practice and to generate meaning. The behavioral uncertainties associated with this redefinition of the interpersonal encounter make the individual actor more vulnerable to negative phenomena. Such negative phenomena, to give but a few examples, are phishing, cyber grooming, happy slapping, or cyberbullying, and they harm the individual in very different ways. In the case of cyber grooming and happy slapping, for example, the violation of the other and his dignity primarily lies in actions that occur in the offline world, when cyber groomers initiate meetings with their victims by flattering them online. As to happy slapping, offline violence is documented and celebrated online. Similar as in the case of cyberbullying, what results is an endless victimization. The victim being always and everywhere reminded of his or her status as a victim. Unlike conventional bullying, where the group of offenders usually grows gradually only and remains limited to certain groups of people, mostly in the working environment, there is no hideaway for victims online. All these online crimes have in common that the inhibition threshold in the web is lower than in a face-to-face situation, and that empathy for cyber victims is significantly weaker. Both phenomena are probably related to the supposed anonymity of the World Wide Web. Such uncertainties in behavior cannot only be observed with regard to the individual, but also with regard to the group. While different groups composed of different generations and cultures can coexist offline unproblematically, through the formation of niches, for instance, they collide in a World Wide Web. This may be a chance if the common interaction in an open, accessible space leads to a better exchange of ideas and consequently to more understanding, tolerance, and awareness of democratic rules and principles. But in reality, this form of societal encounter often is far from being ideal. The user's reactions to the wide range of different opinions exposed in the web often shows no opening at all, but a tendency to polarization, retreat, the denial of the common reality, and finally, the fragmentation into platforms of like-minded people. These tendencies are intensified by governments holding predominant market share or by private enterprise companies through so-called filter bubbles. In order to guarantee an effective personalized advertising and to increase the attractiveness of the company, information that does not coincide with the personal interests or the beliefs of the user is filtered out, eliminated, or shifted to a subordinately sequenced position. For the individual on Facebook, Twitter, or Google, this gradually creates the wrong impression that the world only consists of people who think in a similar way, who pursue similar concerns, or have similar interests. However, where these mental and technical mechanisms can be avoided, the global neighborhood offers a wide range of possibilities to expand one's own horizon, to show solidarity with others and to get involved with them. Some philosophers even think that the ultimate goal of new media is to improve the world. They hereby refer to the user's new closeness to one another, but they also refer to the high quality of the technology involved, which will eventually set free time for creativity and generosity. Even if the gap between reality and ideal seems to be large, the chance of improving man's common interaction is a hopeful perspective. And it is particularly important for the question of human dignity in the social media. But what about morals in general? Is there any such claim in the World Wide Web? Looking for morality in the media, we realize that the actors react with discomfort to the moral standardization of their behavior. This may be due to the authors themselves or to the normative approaches they are confronted with. Could it be that people have become indifferent by interacting with modern media? Could it be that they disregard values and are drifting into an anything goes attitude? Of course, this question is not easy to answer. However, quite a few observations seem to stand against this argumentation. In the publication Diplopie, for example, Clément Cheroux presents an analysis of the images of 9/11, published by US-American journalists. He shows that most of them have deliberately avoided the release of particularly shocking photographs, images of severed body parts, of victims writhing in agony or helplessly falling from the towers. Also, such photographs were available in large quantities. In addition, one could mention a number of case studies, such as those of Christoph Eisenman, who examines the new media rituals that have developed in connection with so-called dedication videos. He comes to the conclusion that these videos, in which mostly made adolescents film scenes from their respective peer group, put them together in an artful collage and dedicate them to their girlfriends, have a very strong value orientation. Also, no explicit commitment is made. The way these video clips are being produced and the underlying reference system they reflect indicate that these adolescents consider a wide range of moral values such as love, faithfulness, friendship, and honesty important components of their lives. There are many other and similar examples, so that we can rightly assume that users have not become indifferent towards moral claims, but that simply their daily routine is too far away from the way ethics has been practiced in school philosophy. Usually the latter's approaches are abstract and do not aim at providing the individual with assistance in a concrete situation. At the same time, most people do not reflect upon which ethical theory might be adequate in their everyday lives. They rather respond by force of habits to the practical requirements of a given situation. I therefore dedicated my research of the past years to the study of the moral beliefs that media users share in a more or less reflected way and that underlie their everyday habits. To this end, I analyzed a large number of self-commitment codes in which media operators from the sectors journalism, entertainment, communication, public relation and advertising, but also communities of media users commit themselves to certain values. The codes I considered are, on the one hand, international documents that are of importance throughout Europe or even worldwide, on the other, national papers of the German-speaking countries, Germany, Austria and Switzerland. The analysis of approximately 30 self-commitment codes shows that behind the concrete formulations of commandments and prohibitions there are certain values the authors of the documents believe to be important. It is evident that such commitment does not automatically imply that respective values are actually being adhered to. But this is not our first concern, because first we need to find out which are the values the user considers as indispensable. And it is only in a second step that we might ask ourselves what to do in order to make these values respected in practice. Anyway, while analyzing the documents, it soon became apparent that the multitude of values alluded to could be divided into several groups, sharing a similar concern. Such a first group or cluster of values has to do with transparency. It includes a number of related values, such as truthfulness, which compels individuals to communicate as honestly as possible. Its negative counterpart is delusion, which is to be avoided. Accuracy, on the other hand, does not emphasize so much the good intention of the factual coinciding with reality and understanding that underlies the classical correspondence theory of truth. Transparency, on the other hand, in this case not used as an umbrella term, but as one of the values explicitly mentioned in the codes, represents a broader and somehow softer claim, but at the same time is a guarantee against what should be avoided: deception and lie. Transparency also includes the effort to communicate sincerely, which characterizes it as a value that can help us respect the human dignity of others. At the same time, it allows sufficient scope for the manifold forms of dissimulation and deception that are morally harmless: drama, satire, etc. Who communicates transparently does not leave any room for misunderstandings about what kind of communication is happening, but he indicates clearly when he makes a serious statement or a compliment and when he is telling a joke. A second set of values represented in the codices concerns the value fairness. Fairness means, first of all, to abide by game rules. This very general prescription is then usually supplemented by one or more of the following requirements. First, it is inadmissible to treat certain persons differently from others without good reasons. Second, it is inadmissible to discriminate others to take undue advantage on oneself. Third, it is inadmissible to derive benefits from a system maintained by the contribution of others for oneself without making an adequate contribution. Fourth, it is inadmissible to punish or condemn people inappropriately. Point 3 is called the free rider problem, which deals with a person, the free rider, who, without making a contribution or making a small contribution only, benefits from cooperation to a greater extent than those who make an appropriate contribution, as it is the case when using the underground without buying a ticket. Such behavior is usually considered to be unfair, while a reverse, supererogatory behavior, when a person makes an inadequately big contribution and in doing so derives little or no benefit from cooperation, is considered morally neutral or even particularly praiseworthy. Finally, yet importantly, fairness is found in procedures where no party is being favored. The prohibition of unequal treatment, that is, unequal treatment without a good reason, is concrete in terms of content and as such largely unproblematic. The situation is different when it comes to observing certain rules. The requirement to respect a certain set of rules is undefined with regard to contents. It is a procedural rule only which presupposes all parties' consensus regarding the specific conditions. In this respect, fairness alone would be too vague, for it only becomes concrete and workable when combined with other values. In contrast to transparency, a value that seems to fit in particularly well with the requirements of social media, fairness assumes a much more general claim and therefore also plays an important role in other fields of applied ethics. There is, for example, a close connection between fairness and human dignity, because he who respects the dignity of another person will endeavor not to treat him in an unfair way, nor give him disadvantage, etc. And there finally exists another obvious connection with human dignity in the case of a value that also proved to be significant in the codes examined: respect. Respect means first of all the appreciation, that is the feeling of approval and liking you have for another person, which also implies accepting this person as an equal partner. At the same time, respect means tolerance, which is to accept others as they are. The term respect then subsumes politeness and the art of considerate behavior, among others, which has sometimes been called courtesy for interaction in the codices. In a specific situation, politeness or courtesy may imply the use of upper and lower case letters so that the reader does not get the impression you should shout at him. Uppercase looks as if you're shouting. Among the group of values that refer to respect, we also find the value of non-damaging, which would come into play, for example, when people and their stories are being exhibited in TV formats such as Frauentausch, where women have to act as mothers in another family for a week, or horror tattoos, where people show their ugly and disfiguring tattoos to the public and tearfully beg for an expensive cover-up tattoo without paying for it. Another form of respect is the moral claim of privacy, which should not be violated. Having privacy means, on the one hand, not to be manipulated by others, and on the other hand, to be able to withdraw from the public, to lead a self-determined life, withholding private data, and to be free to decide with whom these data may be shared. Needless to say that problems of privacy arise in the field of data processing, where the responsibility does not lie with a single actor, but with a computer program. And there are many more situations in Web 2.0 where one can decide whether to respect somebody else's privacy or not, and when it comes to revealing a person's identity behind a nickname or an avatar, and so on. The value respect expresses a positive attitude, as we have seen, but its meaning is basically confined to the idea of keeping limits and clearly saying no to violations or destructive and aggressive acts. Responsibility, on the contrary, which is also an important issue in the codes, is a value that clearly involves positive commitment and the attitude of helping other persons, and it therefore is definitely more than a simple decision or wish not to harm or hurt. In recent years, Rüdiger Funiek has repeatedly argued that responsibility takes place on different levels and that not only the producer of media contents but also their user is responsible for protecting the other person's human dignity. When Funiok declares responsibility to be a central value of media ethics, he takes up the long tradition of Martin Buber, Hans Jonas or Emmanuel Levinas, all of whom have considered responsibility a fundamental principle of ethics. However, to act as a responsible person, you must have a certain amount of sensitivity. You must be able to pay attention to the other and have the willingness to empathize with his or her situation. But there is more. There are also codes which require the actor's active involvement by demanding that the individual should feel responsible for spreading counter-narratives against discrimination, political manipulation and hatred, or should practice a higher sense of serving the public. In addition to the values mentioned, there are a number of other values which do not appear in every document, but still in some of them. I'm talking about serenity, discretion, objectivity, openness, diligence, and professionalism. The question therefore arises whether it is possible to define one value that adequately summarizes all these ideals. This value or concept would not only refer to the technical skills of using modern media, but also to the ability to understand their relevance and deal with it. And this is exactly what media ethicists mean by competence. It is the ability to act in a self-organized way, in the light of changing demands, and it is broad enough to include the values mentioned above, since competence always depends on the context and is concretized differently in different situations. Besides, the openness of the concept also has the strength that is required to meet the rapidly changing challenges of the Web 2.0. After this short survey of the most important values that can be deduced from the various codes of self-commitment, what needs to be done is to apply them to the problem areas mentioned at the beginning. Before I do that, however, let me briefly quote the German media ethicist Alexander Filipovich, who has translated the values mentioned into action recommendations. They are much more concrete than the values as such, and at the same time they show more clearly the connection with the topic that concerns us here, that is social media. 1. Transparency. Make sure that when acting, there always is an adequate, correct relationship between representation and what is being represented. Keep your acting in the media as transparent as possible, so that all that participate in the process and all that are concerned can verify your way of communicating and of shaping the media as to its correctness and non-delusion. Second, fairness. When acting in the media, make sure to obey the existing legal and moral rules. Treat people equally. Be just, which is to say, try to keep the group of people to be treated equally as wide as possible. Be fair and do not seek your own advantage at the cost of others. 3. Respect. When acting in the media, consider others as having the same rights as you. Do not only avoid disrespect, but actively pay respect to others. Appreciate them for their own value and accept their peculiarities and limitations. Watch your acting in the media with regard to politeness and non-discrimination, especially when creating a public space, when using images and expressing critique in whatever form. 4. Responsibility. Before acting in the media and in communication, reflect upon the consequences of your actions and whether they can be justified. Align your acting in the media with the goal of good coexistence for all. 5. Competence. Be professional in every respect. Observe the rules of craftsmanship that determine your acting in the media and your expertise. Act competently. Make sure that competence is being observed. Always be accurate in your work. Allow sufficient time for your colleagues and your work team to work accurately and professionally. Stay calm and don't react emotionally when acting in the media. These 5 imperatives, however, and I come to my conclusion, these 5 values, transparency, fairness, respect, responsibility and competence, must not stand side by side in an isolated way. They must be related to each other in the respective decision-making situation. They imply prima facie duties or obligations. And when a conflict arises, these prima facie obligations have to be weighed against each other until a well-reasoned response has been found. Unfortunately, there is not enough room for going into these methodological details of a reconstructive ethics. But let us conclude with a handful of prima facie duties that result from the values mentioned. With regard to the problem areas mentioned at the beginning, how can we put these values into practice? With regard to transparency, I can and I ought to realize this particular value by not letting myself be guided by misinformation found in filter bubbles, but by checking carefully which content I can trust. As a result, I will uphold the dignity of the people I share information with and also of those who are being reported on by clarifying where this information comes from or by only passing on information that is solid. Fairness then does not only mean not to engage in cybercrime malpractices, but also and above all not to be a silent spectator and or an accomplice. When confronted with happy slapping, for instance, I will do everything I can do to stop this process and to disrupt the victim's endless victimization. Respect means that I actively engage with others and with their rights, even so it is not so easy to feel empathy with others online as in real life. The same applies to responsibility, a principle I can realize in the internet by promoting projects of global neighborhood, by supporting aid projects or raising awareness for the suffering of people who do not have a lobby and whose problems do not become apparent easily. But it is not only important to protect others and show commitment by implementing conscious media actions in the web. It is equally important to protect myself. I do so by acquiring competence and by paying attention to whether my self-staging on Facebook or Instagram corresponds to what I really am, or whether I present myself in order to get likes and followers. The list of examples could be continued endlessly. Be that as it may, it should have become clear that values in the media are not simply given, but have to be realized in the continuous process of active commitment. The media, and especially the social media, are part of our lives. They are living spaces where people interact and come together. Therefore, the more values we have been dealing with are being put into practice, the better our online life will be, and the more worth living. Thank you for your attention.